A memory was not a ghost. It could not be exorcised. It was a splinter of glass driven deep into the flesh, unseen but for the festering wound it left behind. Leanne knew this because she carried 1,000 such splinters, each one a reminder of Alistair Sterling's touch, his voice, his suffocating possession. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the iron tracks was a frantic heartbeat, her own heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was running. Each mile the steam locomotive devoured was a mile between her and the gilded cage of Sterling's San Francisco mansion. He had called her his porcelain doll, his oriental treasure, something to be displayed and admired, but only ever handled by him. And his handling was a cruel, methodical breaking. The light blue prairie dress felt like a costume, a desperate camouflage. He had always insisted on silks and intricate embroidery, dresses that whispered of wealth and ownership. This simple cotton, purchased with the few dollars she had managed to steal from a housekeeping purse, was the uniform of her escape. It was the color of a hopeful sky, a sky she hadn't truly seen in years. The summer heat pressed in through the open window, thick with the dust of the Nevada plains. It was an oppressive, suffocating heat, yet it felt cleaner than the perfumed air of her prison. Every man who boarded at the small, dusty stations, every sharp laugh or deep voice, sent a fresh spike of terror through her. She kept her head down, the brim of her borrowed bonnet low, praying for invisibility. She was a ghost now, of her own making. A ghost fleeing the man who believed he owned her soul. He would not let her go. She knew that with a certainty that was colder than the sweat on her skin. Alistair Sterling did not suffer losses. He did not tolerate defiance. His pride was a monolith, and she had just chiseled a deep crack in its foundation. The hunt would be on. It was not a matter of if, but when. The shriek of tortured metal was the first warning. A violent, gut-wrenching lurch threw Leanne against the hard wooden seat as the train shuddered to a halt. Outside, the endless expanse of sagebrush and sun-baked earth stretched to a shimmering horizon. There was no station, no water tower, nothing but the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Great Basin. Men shouted, their voices sharp with alarm and frustration. A conductor, his face grim and streaked with sweat, walked the length of the car. "Cracked axle, folks. We ain't moving for a while. Might be hours. Might be tomorrow." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Leanne. Stuck, exposed, a sitting duck in a metal box under a merciless sun. The air in the car grew heavy and stale, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and rising fear. Hours crawled by. The water ran out. A baby wailed incessantly, its cries a thin, sharp nerve in the oppressive silence. Leanne watched the sun bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in brutal shades of orange and red. She knew she could not stay on this train. When they finally fixed it, it would continue its journey to towns where Sterling's influence, his money, his telegraph messages could reach. She had to disappear where no one would think to look. As dusk began to settle, blurring the edges of the world into a soft, gray mystery, she made her decision. Slipping out of the train car on the side opposite the harried work crew, she dropped silently to the coarse gravel of the railway bed. With one last, terrified glance at the stranded locomotive, she turned and ran, not towards the memory of a road, but into the vast, open wilderness. The simple blue dress snagged on thorns, and the thin soles of her shoes were no match for the rocky ground, but she did not stop. She ran until her lungs burned, and the train was just a distant, silent shape against the encroaching night. The world dissolved into a terrifying tapestry of shadow and sound. The howl of a distant coyote, the rustle of unseen things in the dry brush. Every noise was a phantom sent by Sterling. The moon, a cold silver coin, offered little comfort, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters at the edge of her vision. Thirst was a living thing, a clawing beast in her throat. Her flight from the train had been born of pure instinct, a desperate gamble against the certainty of capture. Now, as the enormity of the wilderness pressed in on her, she wondered if she had merely traded one cage for another, infinitely larger and just as deadly. By dawn she was stumbling, her vision blurring at the edges. The pale blue of her dress was dark with sweat and smudged with dirt. Her feet were a raw, throbbing agony. The sun rose with a brutal, immediate heat, sucking the last vestiges of moisture from the air, from her body. She saw a flicker of movement in the distance and froze, her heart hammering. But it was only a heat shimmer, the land itself trembling under the solar assault. She fell, her knees scraping against the unforgiving rock and dirt. She tried to rise, but her limbs refused to obey. The world tilted, the brilliant blue sky turning a dark, swirling gray. Her last conscious thought was not of Sterling, but of water. A cool, clear memory of a stream from her childhood, a lifetime ago, in a world that no longer existed. This, she thought with a strange, detached calm, is where I die. It was almost a relief, a quiet end, far from his hands. She was a fallen bird with a broken wing, left for the sun to claim. Then a shadow fell over her. Not a cloud, but something solid, definite. The sound of a horse's soft snort, the creak of leather. She could not lift her head, could not focus her eyes. She felt a presence, a stillness. A pair of worn leather boots entered her sliver of vision. A hand, calloused and large, gently touched her shoulder. She flinched, a ragged gasp tearing from her throat, the last of her strength spent on that one reflexive jerk of fear. Consciousness returned in fragments. The first was the sublime sensation of water, a single, cool drop on her cracked lips. Then another. Someone was holding her head, tilting a metal canteen with an impossible gentleness. She swallowed greedily, the water a shock of life in her parched throat. She coughed, and the hand behind her head was steady, patient. The next thing she knew, she was moving, held securely against a broad, solid chest. The rhythmic sway was that of a walking horse, the scent a mixture of sun, dust, leather, and clean sweat. It was a masculine scent, but it lacked the cloying, expensive cologne Sterling used to mask the rot beneath. This was the smell of earth and work. Fear warred with an exhaustion so profound it was almost a physical weight. She kept her eyes closed, feigning unconsciousness, her mind racing. Who was this man? A bounty hunter? One of Sterling's insidious agents? But his touch was careful. When he had lifted her from the ground, it had been with a quiet strength that held no hint of cruelty or haste. She was a burden, yet he carried her as if she weighed nothing. Finally, the motion stopped. She heard the groan of a gate, the soft thud of the horse's hooves on softer ground. She was carried into a place where the air was cooler, shaded from the relentless sun. He laid her down on something soft. A bed, she realized, with a fresh jolt of alarm. She cracked her eyelids open just enough to see a simple room. Log walls, a stone hearth, a single window with the light softened by a clean cotton curtain. It was spare, rustic, but impeccably clean. The man moved away, his footsteps heavy but measured on the wooden floor. He returned with a bowl of water and a cloth. He did not speak. He simply set them on a small table beside the bed, along with a tin cup of water, then retreated to the far side of the room, sitting in a simple wooden chair, his posture utterly still. He was giving her space. He was waiting. It was the last thing she expected. Leanne lay perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, listening to the quiet sounds of the small cabin, the gentle pop of a log settling in the hearth, the soft sigh of the wind outside, the measured breathing of the man across the room. He did not move, did not speak. He simply sat, a silent guardian, his presence a heavy question mark in the small space. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. The room spun, but she clenched her jaw and waited for it to settle. Her gaze fell on the man. He was not what she'd expected. He was tall and lean, with the broad shoulders of someone who worked with his hands. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship, but not cruelty. His hair was dark, his eyes a startling quiet gray. They watched her not with avarice or command, but with a kind of solemn curiosity. When he saw she was awake and watching him, he gave a slow, almost hesitant nod. He stood, and for a terrifying second she thought he was approaching her. Instead, he walked to the hearth where a pot simmered, ladled some broth into a bowl, and placed it on the table next to the water. "Eat," he said. His voice was low and rough, as if from disuse, but there was no order in it. It was a suggestion, an offering. He then turned and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him, leaving her alone. The gesture was so profound, so utterly alien to her experience that it brought tears to her eyes. Alistair Sterling had never once left a room to give her privacy. Her every moment had been subject to his scrutiny. This stranger, this silent man of the wilderness, had just given her a gift of immense value: choice. She drank the water first, then tentatively tasted the broth. It was simple, just rabbit and wild herbs, but it was the most nourishing thing she had ever eaten. For the next 2 days, this was their silent routine. He would leave food and water for her, then make himself scarce, working outside. He mended her worn shoes, leaving them by the door. He washed her dress, hanging it to dry in the sun before folding it neatly and placing it on the chair. He never entered her room while she was in it without a soft knock, and never stayed. He was building a bridge of trust, one silent, respectful action at a time. On the 3rd day, she felt strong enough to walk. She found him by the corral, mending a leather strap, his hands moving with quiet competence. He looked up as she approached, his gray eyes watchful. She stood for a moment, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. He simply nodded again. "You were a long way from the tracks." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. I was leaving," she said, her voice barely audible. "Leaving a bad situation." He looked at her, at the faint yellowing bruise near her temple that her hair didn't quite cover, and a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He didn't press for details. "My name is Arthur," he said. "You're safe here." Safety was a foreign concept, a shore she had only ever dreamed of from a storm-tossed boat. Yet, day by day, Arthur's quiet ranch began to feel like a harbor. She learned the rhythms of his life, a life dictated by the sun and the needs of his small herd of cattle. He rose before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He worked until dusk, a solitary figure moving with purpose against the vast landscape. He asked nothing of her, but she found she could not remain idle. She started small, sweeping the cabin floor, tending the small vegetable patch he kept near the well. He would return from his work to find a hot meal waiting, and though he never said much, the gratitude was plain in his solemn gray eyes. Words began to come more easily between them, falling into the comfortable silences. She learned he had built the cabin himself, that he had lost his family to fever years ago, and that the solitude was both a comfort and a burden. She, in turn, told him her name was Leanne, and that she had come from a city by the sea. She did not speak of Sterling, but the shadows in her eyes told a story of their own, and Arthur never pushed for more. One sweltering afternoon he told her he had to ride into the small settlement of dusty buildings they called a town, a half-day's ride away, for supplies. "You can stay," he said, his gaze steady, "or you can come. You'll be safe with me." The thought of leaving the sanctuary of the ranch sent a familiar spike of fear through her, but the thought of being left alone was, surprisingly, worse. "I will come," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. The town was little more than a single dusty street, but to Leanne it was a world of terrifying possibilities. Every glance from a stranger felt like an accusation. Arthur seemed to sense her unease, staying close by her side as they entered the general store. The proprietor was a stout, kind-faced woman with flour on her apron. "Arthur Blackwood, good to see you," she chirped, her eyes falling on Leanne with open curiosity. "And who is this?" "This is Leanne," Arthur said simply. "She's staying with me for a spell." The woman, Mrs. Gable, gave Leanne a warm smile that didn't feel intrusive. "Welcome, dear. Any friend of Arthur's is a friend of mine. He's a good man. Too quiet for his own good, but solid as the mountains." The woman's simple, unprompted validation of his character was another stone laid on the foundation of Leanne's trust. But as they gathered their supplies, flour, salt, coffee, the store's bell jingled. A man stepped in, his clothes too fine for the dusty town, his eyes hard and restless. He scanned the store, his gaze lingering on Leanne for a moment too long. Arthur subtly shifted, placing himself between her and the stranger. The air grew thick with a tension only she and Arthur seemed to feel. The man's presence lingered long after he'd left the store, a foul residue in the air. He had not spoken to them, had merely purchased a cigar and departed, but his inspection had been too methodical, his gaze too sharp. He was a hunter. Leanne knew the type. On the ride back to the ranch, the comfortable silence was replaced by a taut, anxious one. Arthur's shoulders were set, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He did not need her to explain the source of her fear. He had seen the man, and he had seen her reaction. The sanctuary had been breached, if only by a look. For the first time, Leanne felt the need to give him a name for the monster that haunted her. "His name is Alistair Sterling," she said, her voice quiet against the wind. "My husband. He is a very wealthy man. He does not like to lose things he has paid for." Arthur's jaw tightened, but he just nodded, his expression grim. "He will have sent men," she continued, "men like the one in the store, to bring me back." "This is my land," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "He has no claim here. You have no claim here." The words were stark, a simple declaration of fact that held more power than any flowery promise of protection. He was not offering heroics. He was offering the simple, unassailable truth of his world. Here, on this patch of earth he had carved out for himself, his word was law. The following days were filled with a new, quiet watchfulness. Arthur began checking the perimeter of his property more frequently. He cleaned his old hunting rifle, his movements economical and grim, a task he performed with a reluctance that spoke volumes. He was a man of peace, but he was not a man who would be pushed. Leanne found her own fear transmuting into a slow, simmering anger. She had run so far, had found this small pocket of peace. She would not let Sterling's shadow fall over it. She refused to be the frightened doll cowering in a box. She had started helping Arthur with more of the ranch work, her hands growing calloused, her skin browning under the sun. She was becoming stronger, not just in spirit, but in body. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to her. "I'm glad you stayed, Leanne," he said. the admission seemingly costing him a great deal. "I am glad you found me," she replied, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. They came 2 days later, just as the afternoon sun began its slow descent. 2 riders cresting the hill that overlooked the cabin. One was the man from the store. The other was larger, with a brutish face and a cruel set to his mouth. They were not visiting. They were invading. Arthur, who had been splitting wood, straightened up slowly, the axe held loosely in his hand. He had seen them long before they reached the cabin. "Leanne," he said, his voice calm but firm, "go inside. Bolt the door." She hesitated, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "Go," he repeated, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. She fled into the cabin, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. She peered through the small gap in the curtain, her breath catching in her throat. The men reined in their horses a dozen yards from Arthur. The one from the store, who Leanne now knew was named Finch, dismounted, his movements arrogant and assured. "Blackwood," Finch called out, a sneer twisting his lips. "We know you have her. The little Chinese runaway. Her husband, Mr. Sterling, is a very important man. He's offering a generous reward for her return." Arthur stood his ground, a silent, immovable object. "There's no one here by that name," he said, his voice flat and even. "She's my hired help." Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Hired help? Don't play dumb with me, rancher. We know she's in there. Just send her out, and we can all have a pleasant day. No need for this to get ugly." "This is private property," Arthur stated, his knuckles white around the axe handle. "You're not welcome here. I suggest you leave." The second man, the brute, swung down from his horse, spitting a wad of tobacco near Arthur's feet. "The only one leaving is us, with the girl. Mr. Sterling doesn't like to be kept waiting." He started to walk toward the cabin, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. Arthur moved to intercept him, placing his body squarely between the man and the door. "You'll not take another step," he warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. The air crackled with menace. This was it, the moment she had been dreading since the train first pulled away from the station. The violence she had fled had found her. Inside the cabin, Leanne's world had shrunk to the space between the floorboards and the ceiling. Her blood ran cold, and the old, familiar paralysis threatened to take hold. She could hear their voices, the sneering demands of Finch, the low, unyielding rumble of Arthur's replies. He was out there, alone, defending her. A man she had known for mere weeks was standing against the monolithic power of Alistair Sterling, armed with nothing but his conviction and a wood-splitting axe. The brute's threat to break down the door was the spark that ignited the kindling of her anger. They saw her as an object, a piece of property to be retrieved. They saw Arthur as a simple obstacle to be brushed aside. They did not see her as a person who had made a choice. They did not see him as a man defending his home. In that moment, something shifted within her. The fear was still there, a coiling snake in her belly, but it was no longer in control. She would not hide behind this good man's courage and let him suffer for it. This was her fight, her freedom, her life. With a steadying breath, she slid the bolt back. The heavy wood scraped loudly, and the sound made all 3 men outside turn. The cabin door swung open. Leanne stepped out into the harsh afternoon light, blinking as her eyes adjusted. She stood on the porch, her back straight, her chin held high. She was wearing the simple blue prairie dress, now faded from the sun and mended in several places. It was the uniform of her new life, not her old one. Finch's face split into a triumphant grin. "Well, well, there she is. Decided to be sensible, have you, darling? Come along now. Mr. Sterling is very eager to see you." He took a step forward, his hand outstretched, as if to claim a stray animal. "I am not going with you," Leanne said. Her voice did not tremble. It was clear and sharp, cutting through the tense air. Finch stopped, his smile faltering. He looked from her to Arthur, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had expected a cowering, terrified creature, not this woman who stood before him with a spine of steel. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "I said," Leanne repeated, taking a deliberate step forward, "I am not going with you. I am not Mr. Sterling's property. My name is Leanne, and this is my home now." The brute snorted. "Listen to her. Thinks she has a choice." He started toward the porch again, but Arthur moved with surprising speed, the head of the axe now pointing directly at the man's chest. "She made her choice," Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and you will respect it." The standoff was absolute. Finch's bravado was beginning to fray at the edges. This was meant to be a simple retrieval, not a bloody confrontation with a stubborn rancher and a defiant woman. He was a bully, accustomed to his victims folding in fear. He didn't know how to handle this. Leanne looked directly at him, her dark eyes holding his gaze without flinching. "Tell Mr. Sterling that he no longer owns me. Tell him I will not be returning. If he sends you or anyone else here again, you will be met as trespassers. Now leave." Her words were not a plea, they were a command. It was the voice of a woman who had been to the bottom of despair and had clawed her way back. A woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The finality in her tone, the unyielding presence of Arthur at her side, it was enough. The two men exchanged a look. This was more trouble than it was worth. With a curse, Finch motioned to his partner. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. They mounted their horses and rode away, kicking up dust in their wake, their retreat a stark admission of defeat. Leanne watched them go, her body finally starting to tremble as the adrenaline receded. Arthur lowered the axe, his shoulders slumping slightly. He turned to her, his gray eyes filled with a profound, aching tenderness. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He simply reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. The immediate danger was past. The shadow of Alistair Sterling would likely linger, a distant threat on the horizon. But here, in this small patch of wilderness, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, they stood together. She was no longer a porcelain doll, but a woman forged in the fire of adversity. He was no longer a lonely rancher, but a man with a reason to stand and fight. Their hands clasped, they turned to face the vast open country, their future as uncertain and as full of promise as the land itself. The healing had begun.